Jessica, welcome to the Dark Night of the Soul Unwrapped. I know it's taken us a long time to get here for all sorts of reasons, so I'm so glad that we could do this now.
Me too. It's been a long time coming, that's for sure. So
Yeah,
very meaningful to see it coming to fruition and getting to be a part of it. So thank you.
me too. Thank you. Yeah, me too. So I thought a good place to start is what was going on just before your Dark Night of the Soul began?
It's a good question. Good place to start. I would say, of course, you might say in some ways your whole life is leading up to the dark night of the soul. But for me, I would say it was really maybe 4 or so years before that real kind of crisis point of, oh my God, I'm in a dark night of the soul. It was, I would say, was kicked off by my journeying deep into the world of modern non-duality and specifically neo-advaita. And maybe it can be helpful to clarify that a little bit
Yeah,
with when I say modern non duality, I'm referring to a set of teachings that are loosely revolving around the idea that there is no self. The individual self is either a complete delusion and unreal, like you might get more so in like radical non duality or neo advaita. Sort of the message is you are not a person, you do not exist, there's nothing, there's nobody. And that the key to freedom is this notion of liberation as the end of suffering, sort of a la all of the Enlightenment traditions, is just to have that instant recognition that will overhaul your entire sense of self in one shot. And then on maybe along the spectrum, then there's also more of the modernized, let's say, just a melange of sort of Buddhist strands of the no self doctrine mixed in with Hinduism, with Advaita. And so it was a range of the language of the personal self is the false self, the true self is amorphous, non physical, impersonal, pure awareness or consciousness. So it was really this dissolution path following these teachers that were telling me the reason why you're suffering is because of this false sense of reality that you have. You think that you exist as an individual, separate person, but you actually do not. And your real self is just infinite, open amorphousness. And so that sort of kicked off this major major journey beyond myself, if you will, that was both glorious and liberating in many ways, and then eventually turned into a complete nightmare, dehumanized nightmare, and then to the dark night of the soul. So that's I'm sorry, very not super specific, but that's my initial nutshell.
yeah. There's so much in there already. I'm wondering what it was that initially drew you to those teachings, what you thought was drawing you to those teachings at the time, and what in retrospect your understanding of that would be.
That's such a beautiful question, I have to say, and I've had to consider that for many years, and it's a really big part of what helped me get out of that dark night of the soul. I thought that had just found this very unique, esoteric, magical way of silencing my mind, for one, and having this sort of instant magic wand that could just disappear my suffering and disappear my thoughts and just erase me from the equation. And I really felt for a while like this was a journey towards discovering the truth. So, the truth of reality, the truth that will set you free, if you will. So, I felt like I was really just discovering the ultimate portal to, let's say, to be pretty straightforward, just the ultimate portal to freedom from all of my sort of mental suffering and from that sort of, you wrote about it a little bit in your book, when it feels like
Yeah.
prison of me and you hear this message, of course, all you have to do is get rid of yourself because you're the problem. So it's very, very attractive. And of course, I also thought that I was joining all of the people throughout time who had gone on this quest towards discovering this universal truth that I do now question, that you are not a person. And yeah, I also thought that I was just exploring mysticism and another way of being in the world beyond sort of the complexities of the human condition and relationships and messiness and all of that. what I realized later on is much more complicated than that, and I think one of the first things to say, and we can unpack that maybe later if you want, is to bring up this notion of spiritual bypassing, because I realized the extent to which what I was being offered was really this escape hatch. It was this kind of
Mm,
fabricated, like, prison break experience that there's no a lot of the rhetoric was, "Don't do healing work, there's no you to improve." Really, it's all just about deconstruction, tear it all down, just be with the pure, silent, infinite awareness that you are. And so it was, in many ways, I think, this very understandable and powerful way to sidestep, if you will, all of the root causes of why I was suffering so much in my own mind, when ostensibly I had a good family, I had a good job, I never suffered for want of money or food or comfort, but I felt imprisoned in my mind. I had extreme rumination and a crippling
mm,
death and all of these things that really felt like mental chains, and I know a lot of people can relate to that. But instead of learning really how to understand all of that and learn how to be with myself and love myself and heal some of those things so that I don't have to throw myself out with my bathwater, went for this sort of easy way out kind of thing. For me, it felt easy. It felt easy to dissolve into the what is the phrase was, the point of all the suffering is just to realize that the one who's suffering doesn't exist. And that was really easy for me for various reasons to go into that sort of dissolution, impersonalized experience. But what I started realizing as the years unfolded after all of this kind of impersonal existence, I started to realize how much the core roots of a lot of those things were still there. They were still getting triggered, and just how much I was just trying to and was rising above it and finding peace there, but in very much a way that was just trying to sever off from it and disassociate from it rather than actually turn towards it and heal and integrate it, if you will.
absolutely. So in those 4 years, it sounds like there were times when the magic wand was working, so to speak, that there was a transcending or dissolving of your sense of self. What was that like? What was the appeal of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, so I think that I've described it a lot as there being like a honeymoon stage that you can go through when you start exploring these different pointers and these meditative techniques. And some of it's, again, really just a verbal pointer of what are you in the space between thoughts, and then elongating that and expanding that. And then the dropping away of the thoughts and the inner noise and even your physicality. There's something very, I talk about it a lot, almost as a drug, as an anesthetizing
Mm,
drug that you can experience. And I think that some of these states that you can get into are extremely understandably give you a feeling of invulnerability, because when you really when all of your boundaries collapse and your entire sense of embodiment is gone and you're just free floating in this infinite open expanse, and there's nothing for anything to hit against and all of that, it can be extraordinary in the same way that I imagine when somebody shoots up heroin, it's like sweet oblivion. But this isn't a drug, this is just the truth, this is just reality. So it was hard to see what was unhealthy about it at the time. But I think one thing that is maybe good to bring in early is that I wouldn't say to people that there's no value to have such an experience. A lot of people take psychedelics and they have these dissolution experiences, but it was the narrative that I was indoctrinated into was, this is only about disappearance and deconstruction. This is not in the service of reconstruction. It's not in the service of rebirth, permanent a permanent destruction project. This is about the final end of you. So that the goal was not, let's expand and access these different states of being so that we can be in the world and be in relationships and express ourselves in better, healthier ways, it was just destroy and then you're free. And that freedom is, I would say, a very sharp double-edged sword and very much what I've described sometimes as like a nectar laced with poison, if you will,
Mm,
that we might go into.
yeah, it's a great phrase. So I'm thinking back to where I was in around 2007, 2008, when I was already in the Dark Night and I started to explore some of the teachings that we're talking about. I think because I was already in the Dark Night phase, they weren't able to take hold in the way that you describe. And at the time, I know that I would have given anything to start to experience what you were just describing. Because for me, there were the people who had got it, and I'm guessing that there was a period of time when it felt like you had it, and those of us who didn't. And of course, what I understand now is that of course, I wanted to get out of the pain. Was there a period of time when it felt like you were there, you were in this dissolved realm?
Yeah, I would say for me, it started happening pretty quickly after I started reading books by Eckhart Tolle and Michael Singer and Jeff Foster, and then Adyashanti, Rupert Spira, Ramana Maharshi, Nisargadatta, just to give an idea of what I was engaging with. It happened pretty quickly for me that I had that experience that a lot of people talk about as like the moment of their spontaneous awakening. And I personally wouldn't even describe it in those words anymore, but I had that first major shift into, oh, this is the experience that's being talked about, and it is even better than I thought than they described it to be. And so it was utterly life-changing, and there was a very big sense of before and after, and I felt that I was saved from myself now because I was of course, I
Mm.
wasn't experiencing my own absence all the time, and I would say that most people are not, even if they say they are. I was increasingly dipping into that sort of blow up experience of just disappearing into boundlessness, and there's a variety of different experiences that come from those teachings. That's one of them. Then there's also like the kind of knowing yourself as just like this background amorphous sort of what's the word layer of reality, if you will, so that everything else is still there. Maybe your body, your thoughts, they're not dissolved in any way, but you're not those things. You're none of that. You're really just this sort of witnessing or what's aware, if you will. I did feel that I was getting it. That's a language people use, that
Yeah.
I just saying it and reading it, that I was having the direct experience, if you will, increasingly more and more. And the more time I spent in that impersonal way of being, the more the changes accumulated and the more my reality changed dramatically, my way of experiencing thoughts, relating to problems. Everything started to just become very trivial, if you will. So that in having that impersonalized experience, it felt all the particulars of life just didn't carry as much weight or as much gravity or have anything to do with me anymore. Of course, it's if you're burning alive on fire and then all of a sudden you're just all you can see is water and you're just in water all the time, it's going to feel like the best thing ever for a while until it's, oh, fire is also really beautiful and wonderful. I don't want to burn to death in it, but I also don't just want to be in water all the time, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. So you're in this place, more or less. At what point did things just start to tip into the opposite of that? I'm really struck by these words: in vulnerability, amorphous, impersonal. And for me, the dark night of the soul is the complete opposite of all of those things. It's vulnerability. It's deeply specific and specific personalness. And yeah, at what point did you start to get a sense that things were tipping?
Yeah, it was a few years in that I started slowly realizing with a lot of shock and horror just how much of my humanity had evaporated or somehow been destroyed along with all of the problems that I was facing. I was realizing what I'd sacrificed or what had been sacrificed. Started to realize that there was a type of deal with the devil that I had unknowingly made. And I started to recognize that I was I could hardly recognize myself as fully human anymore, and I was not able to hold up my end of relationships, so I started to realize that I'd actually harmed like, I felt that I had this absolute freedom, but I started seeing all these things that I could no longer do anymore, so I started to recognize, how is it absolute freedom if I now can't really carry on a conversation without my mind going blank, or if I can't delight in getting to know somebody, or I can't fully remember my life history, or all of these things that I could no longer engage in and enjoy that started to feel like, isn't that a deficit? And of course, I also realized that up until I had decided that truth and freedom were the biggest goals in my life or my biggest values, it would always been relationships and meaningful relationships and connections, and that is what was stripped away from me basically, was because I was no longer present as a person. I was absence itself, or I was presence itself, but there's no one there present. There's intimacy was really, I would say, strained, but in some ways just demolished, because if you think of intimacy as the meeting between me and you and self and other as a meeting point, there was no one here to be for you to be meeting. So I would have to pretend. I would have to pretend that you're meeting somebody here, but that's not me, and that doesn't feel like me. That feels like really like just propping up this old dead character who doesn't exist anymore, like this ghost. And that started to also start to feel a little pathological at the same time, of like maddening and a bit crazy making, of I'm pretending to be somebody, but that person's actually dead, but my body's still here. Like it was all just
Mm.
becoming somewhat dysfunctional as well, and it started to freak me out.
Yeah, when you said the word pathological, I was thinking about derealization and depersonalization and how much of that was actually going on. To feel your own absence to the extent that it feels like that person, that self is dead,
Yeah,
is quite a big thing, isn't it?
it is, and I talk a lot about, or people like to talk a lot about, w where you just depersonalize the whole time, and I don't think it's quite as black and white as that. I think that
Mm.
there's different forms of disassociation and depersonalization, and I definitely think that the idealized state that a lot of these enlightenment traditions are trying to usher you into, no matter how expansive they are and insight bringing they are and freeing they feel, are often, if they're disembodying in any way, and that they are a form of disassociation. And it wasn't the same kind that I had experienced depersonalization as a kid spontaneously, but usually associate depersonalization with like negative affect. And
Yeah.
well, when it started crumbling, I was experiencing it all as positive, because there wasn't someone in there going, "Oh my god, do I exist? Do I not exist? This is terrifying to not exist." That whole voice was crumbled too, so it was just this boundlessness experience without a sense of a me at the center, but all of me was on board with it up until the time when I started to realize, actually, there's elements of this that are not healthy, don't actually really align with what I think maybe my deepest soul values were. And then, hey, what about that soul? And hey, what about all those values that I had? What's happened here? And that kind of then led me to a really terrifying realization of, oh my God, I've done something really dramatic to myself that may have irreparably damaged my some of my foundational human capacities, that if I have to live without those for the rest of my life, this is I can't bear to imagine that I'll never be able to really be in a relationship again. I think I mentioned to you before, like, I really lost my sense of humor. Could laugh at, like, the cosmic joke that nobody's really there, or it's all just this kind of grand appearance with no real substance to it, but I couldn't engage with the particulars or the everyday kind of things that we think of as mundane, but even just being able to sit down and have a coffee with friends and feeling like there's a flow and I'm immersed in the experience, that it couldn't happen, and physical intimacy was starting to feel like something I've tried to explain. I think that was maybe one of the biggest things that kicked off this sense of, "Oh my god," and then I think leading into the Dark Night, which was really about reclaiming all of these personal pieces that I had abandoned or repressed or tried to mangle or destroy, that were still down there calling out for me, that I just wasn't able to hear it. I felt like I had become, I talked about invulnerability, but the flip side of that whole ideal and that desire to be untouchable by suffering, and all these non-dual teachers talk about this like unshakable untouchability and all of this, and god, it sounds so good, but what if that became literal and you were no longer able to be touched? So in a physical sense, because I wasn't this body, I wasn't this vessel. There was no real internal me receiving touch, so that it was like, "Oh my god, I've become something that will never be reachable again. I will never
Mm.
touch in any way because I know myself only as that which is beyond all touch. This pure consciousness that is not any of those things." And so that was a real wake-up call, and a real, I think I cried for days when I felt like I'll never be able to feel what it's like to be what's touched again, or to be the one who's actually touching, and yeah,
Devastating.
very much.
So the parts that, as you said, you tried to mangle or destroy or suppress, how did they come calling? How did they pull you back in?
It took some time for sure, and I think I always talk about this one major event that happened, and I think it's important to talk about it, was that as I was seeing all of this was happening and I was starting to actually enter like real dissociative states that I hadn't experienced before, just wandering around aimlessly and not really realizing where I'm going. There's no one driving the bus. So this whole like non-doership thing had just turned into this a very dysfunctional type of loss of agency and depersonalization, and I went to a Jeff Foster retreat, who was one of the teachers who was influential in leading me beyond and away from myself into this sort of nothing and nobody ness. Like, his whole kind of teaching when I got to him was depression is telling you to drop the burden of being a person and to drop the burden of being somebody and become nobody. And that resonated so much. But when I got to this retreat, maybe 2.5 years later, he had woken up from his neo-advaita stage and saying
Yeah.
all of that was wrong. That was misguided. This is what what he probably said, the spiritual path, but basically was saying that the path that he was now pointing towards was the opposite. It was radical befriending. It was inner child work. It was all of these richly, deeply human contrasts that was like self-abandonment is, I think, a great way to describe a lot of those no self and self-negating non-duality that I like to call it. That it's varying degrees of self-abandonment. It might not even be destroy the person, but just see it as irrelevant and disidentify with it was a big part of it. Disidentify
Yeah.
with it, which to me, if you're wanting to do that permanently, is the ultimate in abandonment. So here you have this room full of people, and I'm dissociated and depersonalized, and realizing the extent to which that abandonment path that this person in front of me had so poetically and in some ways lovingly guided me into was now saying it's time to come back. And I was I don't even know how to describe just thinking of it now, how utterly devastating it was, and I'm comfortable saying, and I even told him, like, "I'm mad at you.
Yeah.
How dare you? I uprooted all of my humanity for what you taught me, and now you're just saying so casually, no, that was wrong. You need to love yourself. It's all your pain is actually asking you not to drop it as a burden, but to honor it and validate it and hug it and kiss it. And like, I was just and angry at the universe. Like, why couldn't he have seen that sooner? Or why couldn't he have waited and not taught something like that so quickly before his path evolved? Because if I had come to him now or he had taught me that at that time, that would have resonated with me even 10 times more than this drop the burden of somebody path. And this just seemed such a tragic thing that I couldn't have heard that message instead. And all this time that I had spent trying to abandon myself that I could have been spending learning how to love myself. And that's when I think a lot of the frameworks around complex PTSD and narcissistic abuse, it all started to come together as, oh, and this whole path really mirrored so much of the messages I received that led me to not value myself in the first place, that made those messages so attractive.
Absolutely. I think it would be really good for us to really unpack a lot of this when in our second episode, because I think there's so much in there about how we're drawn to the parts that replicate or amplify
Yeah.
our histories in some
Yeah.
way. And I think particularly with the way that when we're in the orbit of a narcissist, how our sense of self is unseen in that we're objectified to the extent that the idea of being here as a subject is really wiped out. And obviously, when that happens when we're children, then the idea of this, our sense of self as being wrong, is already so deeply embedded that, of course, when somebody comes along and says, the answer is A, we're set up for somebody else to give us the answer,
Yes.
but B, there's some deep resonance with that idea because of this sense of this whole self being wrong, being
Right. Invalid.
damaged, being shameful, however we describe that.
Yeah.
So, how did the pieces start to come back in? Like you've just had this huge turnaround at this retreat, this being faced with this devastating knowledge that basically it's about turning completely the opposite way round.
Yeah.
How did you even begin to do that?
Yeah. It was absolutely a process, but that retreat was pivotal. And it was actually, I also say I was mad at Jeff, and that's valid. But I also want to say that that retreat itself was also immensely healing because here it was this group and it was all these people and everybody was coming with pain. And it also showed me everybody who raised their hand to share something, so many of the stories, it was all relational. So much of it was being neglected as a kid and being taught that their voice didn't matter, their opinions didn't matter. And then all of a sudden, all of the messages from Eckhart Tolle and Adyashanti and all these people, I'm like, oh my god, it's like a spiritualized version of the same messages, whether or not they intend it to be that way, that it so much of it became clear, but I also in that group container, a lot of grieving was happening, and people were holding each other's
Yeah.
hands and hugging and validating each other, and it showed me I guess it gave me a glimpse of what healing might look like and how important it would need how much it would need to be that a big part of it would need to be not something alone, not one of these solitary paths of I'm gonna heal everything in isolation from the world and just don't need anything or anyone, that we need each other and that we can heal in relationship. But the other thing was that I really started reconnecting with my inner child, but in this very
Mm.
palpable sense of, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to get a sense of self back, like, it might not be possible anymore, and I'm terrified that it won't be possible, but, like, I'm gonna die trying to resurrect the little girl in me, so, like, I
Mm.
took pictures of myself, and I saw the smile on my face that I was so exuberant, and I was in love with people in the world and expressing myself, and I was funny, and I had a very bold character, and I was very vivacious, and all these things that had been like shamed and stamped out of me or seen as egoic on this path was like, how can I get back to honoring those things as core parts of me to celebrate now and to express? And then I needed to find new models of it. At that time, it was important for me to explore other frameworks of spirituality and different models of what well-being means that weren't the Eastern ones that are very much about leaving behind the personal, and then ones that are more that I guess I would say that for me, it was I was needed to carve out like this return path, or some people talk about coming down the mountain, or the discovering that the transcendent is also immanent and expressing as us. So there was a lot that I needed to do in terms of exploring things psychologically with CPTSD, complex PTSD, understanding the things that led me again to be attracted to spiritually abandoning myself. And then, yeah, I mean, it happened in stages, but I pretty quickly realized that like I wanted nothing to do with neo-advaita anymore or any of the self-negating non-dual stuff, and was starting to get towards this vision of, is there a both and? Does it have to be just go back to feeling stuck in this maybe only narrow little me vision and there's no way of having a bigger sense of things? Or can expanding and getting a bigger sense of things include me in it as a real expression? There's so much stuff, and I'm only bringing up like little things that I can remember here and there, but self-compassion absolutely was like leading the charge with it and discovering what a deep, profoundly spiritual practice that can be and is.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's also beautifully put. I was just remembering one moment in the early days of my dark night, and I connected with the pain of being around, I was around 6, I think, and it was as if I was back in the moment when I'd started to conceive of myself as not pretty. I don't
Mm.
think I quite had the word ugly, but it was that moment when I started to believe that I wasn't that. And I was really in the pain of it. I was crying and feeling this. We know how intense the pain in the dark night is as we reconnect with those parts. And I suddenly, like, I'd had my head down crying, and I suddenly looked up, and all I could see was beauty. Same room, same street,
Interesting.
same cigarette ends on the pavement. It was all exactly the same. But suddenly it was like, it was just beautiful. And in that moment, then I was absolutely part of the beauty. There
Right.
wasn't any sense of separation or separateness between me and the beauty. And it was the specificity of me that was beautiful. Like you
Right.
said, all those
Didn't
wonderful
negate you.
qualities of yourself that you just named, this seeing of that in this bigger context, I think.
Right.
And of course, that was an entirely spontaneous experience, as I think so many things are when we're willing to follow the movement that starts to happen within, that
Yes.
takes us into these places, and it feels like we're going to all of the stuff that, as you said earlier, you were trying to mangle or destroy or get rid of or transcend. Suddenly we're in all of that.
Yeah.
And of course, that comes with the most enormous pain, but also these moments of such profound love and beauty and connectedness and all of the rest of it.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I really love about that phrase, both and I know you've done some great talking and writing about this too, is the way that it collapses any need for us to put ourselves in either side of the polarity, that it collapses the binary in that sense
Right.
and doesn't say it's this or this. And so in that place, such reductive ideas like there's no self or whatever it happens to be are
Yeah.
completely nonsensical,
And tragic.
utterly tragic, because we're seeing the amazing nuance and complexity and intricacy and exquisiteness of
Yeah.
of all of this, in obviously including ourselves, that innate sense of Jessica-ness or Fiona-ness, we start to see through a different lens than either CPTSD lens or the so-called spiritual lenses.
Yes.
For me, where that took me in the dark night, pretty quickly, I just couldn't hold on to any teachings. I was in way too much of a state
Yeah.
and in it so viscerally that I didn't have it was like, even though I tried, I failed at it. And of course, it felt like failure for a long time. But I came to see that coming back to ourselves and coming back to everything that had been abandoned, suppressed, and so on meant that I was becoming present in a completely different way. And I
Right.
think that's why I put the subtitle of my book is The Journey from Absence to Presence.
Mhm.
Can you say a bit about how it was for you to start to be present to yourself in the kind of way that we're describing, that isn't this sort of amorphous presence out there somehow, but this really deeply embodied, loving, kind sense of being present to ourselves in whatever we're in?
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a night and day experience. I think that maybe I would talk about it in terms of wholeness, that it felt like the understanding that I got of what wholeness is through the sort of either or non-duality was wholeness is what is left when you get rid of if you s- that you can get to wholeness by getting rid of all the broken pieces. So
Mm.
somehow wholeness is this state that I'm in where all of the parts and pieces are like excluded. And so what started to feel that I started to experience was a different kind of wholeness that meant including. So that path that I had been on of the whole thing and even like Nettie and all that is like exclude, exclude until you get to wholeness when everything else has been, it's like a process of elimination. And so this process became more of yeah, of how much can I include? Because the more I include, the more whole I am. And the more I exclude, if I'm excluding any of these parts of myself, then how could I call that wholeness in any way? And not to say that I don't know that we ever experience every bit of wholeness because it's difficult and we have the subconscious or unconscious, but that feeling I think of when you start to experience all these parts of yourself or they start to come back up to live because you're giving them space just felt, yeah, of going from that kind of fragmentation and that illusion of wholeness where there was no brokenness to now being able to embody this being who's both separate but also unified with everything, but that I am this collection of all these parts and pieces that I want all of these broken pieces to be part of me. And I want to hold them and I want them to have a voice. I want them to sing. I want them to scream. I want them to cry. I want them to laugh. I want all of it. And so it really felt, yeah, I think of like when you think of like a reclamation or it felt, I don't know about you, but I imagine at some point in your journey, maybe you also maybe related in some ways to a sense of like rebirth or like bardo or going through this kind of death where there was no opportunity to just all of a sudden come back to life, but more of this process of going through for me, I think one of the darkest parts of that dark night of the soul for me was that fear that I wouldn't be able to be that phoenix who could rise from the ashes of my own sort of premature death. But
Mm.
was the possibility of that sustained me because it felt like if I can all of this journey has really brought me to the point of now having a possibility where maybe I can now consciously create the person that I wanna be, and I can revive the parts of myself that were, I would say, buried under the floorboards of my consciousness, my humor, my quirkiness, my some of my neediness, all of these different things, my even caring about politics, all these different parts of myself that if I now had this opportunity, if I were to take it in a certain way to be able to reassemble myself, make sure that I have all the essential parts of myself alive and thriving, like pulse check, resuscitation CPR project for a long time. You still there? Oh, you're still alive. Yay. But then also being able to do the healing work actual healing psychology, things like that, that involved doing some healing of some real, like, core wounds, that then some parts of the self that I did wanna get away from in some ways weren't so problematic anymore, but I could then have this opening towards flourishing as a type of person that I really wanna be and who I still can be, and I get to choose who I am, not the nobody that the narcissist wanted me to be, not the nobody that the enlightened gurus wanted me to be. The somebody I can who is that somebody? I don't know fully, but I can create her now, and but it wasn't like an easy step. It was very much, I don't know if these dead seeming things can come back. I don't know if I
Yeah.
can create this new person, but that's parts of the journey. But I can imagine that seems to be a major theme in a lot of Dark Nights of the Soul is death and rebirth and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. I resonate so much with all of that. I just wanted to read you something that I wrote a few years ago because it really fits with what you were saying about the broken pieces. And it's part of a poem which I'll put in the show notes. It's these couple of verses. Your cuts are swifter, frantic, more desperate as you hack away at everything you wish were not so.
Mm,
Despite your efforts to excise all that you dislike, life, whilst it may appear at first to conform to your will, has a tendency to remain stubbornly, brazenly whole. It
mm,
keeps all those discarded, broken, misshapen pieces for you, knowing one day, knowing that one day you will need them. They are essential to your survival, for they are the very thing that your soul most craves.
mm. It's gorgeous. Gorgeous.
And I think that's exactly what you were just saying, that thank God those pieces are still alive. And that was absolutely my experience, that I realized through a different route how half dead I was at the beginning
Yes.
of the Dark Night, and
Mhm.
was absolutely terrified that I might not be able to get back to myself, though
Yeah.
that deadness might remain. And
Yeah.
I've spent a lot of time with other people in that place too. I think the good news is that reclaiming is possible,
Like,
right? That we can create the space in which those parts begin to come back to life. And I'm often astonished by actually once the right conditions for that to happen, how how quickly they often return,
yes,
right?
when they're given the permission.
Given absolutely once they're admitted, once they're included, whatever word we want to use for that. And what I discovered was that all of those broken pieces that had been such a source of shame and
Yeah.
had been shamed, and that's how they came to be broken in the first place, also contained the most incredible preciousness.
Yeah. Yes.
So, yes, I think there's something about finally coming to the place when all of that can start to return, and we're willing to, yeah, be the space in which that can happen, either by being together with other people who can do that for us, or however that comes in. Just before we finish this episode, I've got one more question, if that's okay.
Or
And that is, for what would you like to share with anybody who's writing it just now, who's listening to this?
yeah, I think I would say because there's so many common themes, I think, even if somebody didn't enter that place specifically through neo-advaita or maybe specifically the way that you did, just that reclamation is possible 100%. And as much as I can, like, heap upon people the permission to engage in that reclaiming, and yeah, and also just I think a message to really consider that any of the voices in your life, whether they're spiritual or coming from people that you know or the media that are trying to dissuade you from doing that, to really I'll just be blunt and say to I would distrust those voices very strongly. That anybody who's
Yeah.
trying to because I was gonna say one of the things is that a lot of people who go through dark nights of the souls, there's often a narrative that comes up in a lot of paradigms in spiritual communities that you need to surrender your permanently surrender the ego and the self, and that there's going to be a lot of these temptations to go back to the personal, but don't do that. This is showing you your ultimate way away from this is towards an ultimate ego death, to really understand. And if you listen back through this conversation, all the forces that drive that type of mentality, maybe we can even have compassion for that, because to understand that the parts of us that don't want to give us that permission, whether it's coming from us or from other people, is yet another wounded part of ourselves, that to really
Completely.
humanize all of it. And yeah, to say that absolutely, that if you, another thing I think is also that whole idea of wanting to like rush through it to get to the other side is completely understandable, but just to like really honor the fact that you're in like a remarkably profound place in your life that is so shitty and agonizing, but it has so much rich soil to plant these seeds in for rebirth. And you might not be seeing that happening yet. But yeah, I think really just to really do whatever you can to deeply give yourself permission and be around and absorb voices of other people that are really giving you permission to reclaim any lost parts of yourself, or whether they're lost or they're faded or disidentified with. But yeah, just I guess to say keep going with it, and it's worth it.
Yeah,
Worth it.
absolutely. It really isn't it, just to say, because we both know that. We both know both the bittersweetness of
It is
going through it and just how much more human and humane we've become as a consequence of going through it. And the reclamation is still going on, right? It's not like we've got to some point and said, okay, we're done, but we're in a very different phase with it now that has a completely
exactly,
different feeling tone to it. So
definitely.
thank you for sharing that. That's really lovely. And thank you so much. I really look forward to our next episode.
Thank you for the opportunity, and me as well.
Pleasure. Bye now.
Bye for now.